Siya.
Sure. Um, hi, everyone. I've looked at the knowledge, the skills, the values, or the being that we want to see, and it really interests me to see how all these are kind of related from almost every one of us. We've got these expectations, we've got kinds of knowledges based on our fields of practice that we want to see, the skills and the values which we want our students to show. So I'm going to be talking about attributes, but firstly, exercise so that you understand that at the center of what you are doing as a teacher or as an academic is an idea of an identity of the graduate. In other words, there is some kind of knowledges, kind of skills, kind of values that you'd want to see in those graduates. So, but the question is to how do these skills, knowledges, and values come to be realized? In other words, how do we ensure that at the end of the day, our students would have such kind of dispositions or knowledge and skills that we want them to show? So, at the center of my presentation, I'll be talking about ways in which we develop students through our practices. So the challenge is that we should know that whatever that we are doing, when we are teaching, the affordances that we bring for students or the opportunities that we bring for our students would either make this identity possible or not, depending on how you do what you are doing. So that was my reflection on what I saw. But now let me start with my introduction and talk about the graduate attributes and why universities are thinking about graduate attributes. Okay. Um, Firstly, the idea of graduate attributes in higher education comes predominantly from countries like Australia, like New Zealand, um, and other Western countries um, at some length in Australia and New Zealand. But in the UK as well, we see how they grappling with the notion of graduate athletes. And in South Africa, CHE also brings this into higher education and makes universities think about the graduates that we develop. Okay, so Cput also got into the space of reimagining graduate attributes or the kind of graduate that we want to develop or we envisage for our university. So the most important thing I want you to know is that higher education is a very highly contested space. It's a highly contested space because people want to use higher education to achieve their own interests. Okay, we can think about the industries. Some of us in our introduction were talking about how we want to develop graduates that would get to the world of work and hit the ground running. That is important for the industry because out of that, they make profit. So if you develop graduates that are not ready for employment, um, so the much into But it's not only industry, it's also more broadly. In society, you would know that dominant actors in society usually use who they are, and who they are would be then reflected on ways in which we develop graduates. So higher education in that way becomes a tool that is used to reproduce the identities of dominant actors in society. Okay, so briefly, that's how we think about the notion of graduate attributes. So Cput, we also thought deeper about what it is, what kind of graduates that we want to develop. And then the central question was to for whose interests. Okay. So you can imagine that if I said they are actors, agents, and institutions who higher education for will go to university and develop skills for industry that would work for industry because they would work for the industry for the rest of their lives. In other words, um, you are reproducing the societal hierarchies through education. So we had to think beyond, not that we say we do not or we should not develop skills for people that are ready for the industry, but to say that we need to think beyond the interests of that particular sector, that is the industry, and think about people that would go to the industry not as workers, but also as employers or as people, someone talked about entrepreneurs, people that would identify new opportunities and start new jobs so that employment opportunities can widen. So there are various ways in which people think about identities or these graduate attributes. So at Cput, we said we need to think beyond the skills or employability approach that we need to for employment. From there, you could easily see why. Because I said, if we focus simple on those skills or employability, we would be training people that would go to the industry and work, and then they would work for the rest of their lives. So we looked at capabilities approach, and then we said this approach is much better compared to the previous one or the dominant one, which is skills or employability approach. And then we said capabilities approach brings us an idea of a graduate. And this idea of a graduate as something that is a real possibility. In other words, we can think about these graduate attributes as things that will come out of our practices, not in the university, because they come from vocations. In other words, an identity arise out of a particular social order. So when we're thinking about graduate attributes, we're thinking about the kind of people that are needed in vocations. So if someone is working, for instance, I saw those who are from the film industry, you have an idea of a graduate that comes from that industry, which is film industry. So through your work, what you teach, how you teach, the opportunities that you bring to or for the student would enable this real possibility, that is the identity, to be realized. It cannot happen out of the blue. You cannot just wish and say, "Hey, I want this kind of a graduate um, to to um, to come out." you need to look at it as an ideal. Remember, I said it's a real possibility. And then you ask yourself, to what extent that I'm doing, that is the way in which I teach, the opportunities that I bring for my students, making this graduate attribute or the identity of the student possible. So you cannot here think that your students will be able to communicate effectively with others without creating an opportunity for others or for the students to practice, to learn how to communicate effectively. So this helps us to start with the kind of a student that we want to develop, and then we then look at our own practices and see how those practices enable or constrain the development of the identity that we want to achieve. Okay, that was my introduction. But again, before I leave this introduction, I want you to um, look at these possibilities or these identities and say, in a society that is well ordered, you can have identities that are relevant for that well ordered society. But in a society where you've got a particular history of oppression, history of marginalization of people based on who they are, then that is a non-ideal world. So you thinking about the identity of a graduate, you should think about the society that this graduate will work or live. In other words, how do we develop graduates for a society like ours with scars and history we have? So that is why then when we're talking about these attributes, we connect graduate attributes or the identities with the history or the context in which these people would operate. And then we say, in our context, because it's a non ideal context, it's a non ideal world, how do we then develop graduates that will work in those realities which are non-ideal? Non-ideal in the sense that no one, I think, most of us would not want us to continue society with that kind of history or with those scars that we have. So that we developed at Cput are the graduates that would work, make us engage real problems of our world, the world that we are thrown into, which I'm claiming that it's non-ideal. It's non-ideal in the sense it's a world that is. You want to say something? Okay. I can hear that someone wants to. Uh-huh. I can't hear you. I happen not to hear you. Hello?
You can also, if your connection is not enough.
You're breaking up. Yeah, I know what
I still can't. Mm. Can you type on that space where it says where it says say something?
say something. Okay.
I happen to struggle to hear you, Stella. So can I go on and continue with? Mhm. I'm talking to myself, Daniela here. Hello.
Yes. Here you say, I think.
Oh, you can hear me now. Sure. So let me move on.
Switch off his video.
Yeah.
He can.
Sure. No, I was explaining that in thinking about graduate attributes at Cput, we took into consideration the context. That is, this non-ideal world where these graduates would end up working. So imagine a child who would go into a society where people do not get equal opportunities, and the university doesn't prepare the child for that world. So, in developing these attributes, we had that into our minds or into consideration. So, we understand identities to be coming out of the social order through relations which the identities enters with other identities. There can't be a generic attribute for a student who's registered for engineering and a student who's registered for teaching. There can't be that generic attribute. So these attributes must speak to the occupations or the vocations in which these students would end up living. So in developing your attribute or your graduate attribute, you need to understand that a student who's doing filmmaking would think like a professional or that vocational being at the end of the day. Okay, so that was my introduction on this notion of graduate attributes. So we frame them as capabilities, and these capabilities are those potentials. So we can look at what the students are able to do, which are functions. In other words, we say what it is that the students, as we see them in our classrooms, are able to do, and that we use that as a proxy for capabilities and say, now that the students can work together, as an indication that they will achieve the capabilities that we want them to achieve. Okay. But then in achieving those capabilities, we need to work to understand that this will requires us to create an environment which would make this possible. Then the question would be that I would want to throw to you is to, if this is possible, or we say these are real possibilities, how do we then work through our practices as academics, as people who train the students, as people who engage with industry, so that the context enables these attributes to emerge or to be realized? So this is the question that we're all sitting with at Cput or as a Cput community to say, if the university wants these kinds of attributes or graduates, then what do we need to do to make us achieve those attributes? So Cput identified 4 of these attributes, but at the center of this project is justice. So in terms of justice, we are using Ubuntu as an African philopraxis of liberation. So Ubuntu is at the center here. And then we see, let's look at our practices as teachers and ask this difficult question. And this difficult question would be, to what extent is my pedagogy enabling justice or constraining justice? So this project then requires us to be reflective of our own practices as teachers. What we teach, how is it enabling or constraining a development of the attribute that to see at the end of the day. So Ubuntu is at the center, but Ubuntu is simple a pedagogic approach, or it's a higher goal that should be guiding all our practices. I see that Aaron is experiencing technicalities there. So I will keep on talking.
But maybe we can ask questions.
Oh, sure.
If people have any comments.
So yeah, can we hear can we hear from you as to whether you understand what we're trying to share with you at the moment? So questions.
Or any feedback,
Any
any
feedback,
comments.
so that we understand if we are still together. The last few sentences. Okay, I can hear you, Aaron. So in my last sentences, I was talking about Ubuntu. Ubuntu as a philosophical approach that we put at the center, and then we say as Cput, if we are to achieve the kind of graduate attributes that we want to achieve or we envisage, we need to put justice at the center. And justice here will be presented by this African philosophical value of Ubuntu. So the question that we're asking ourselves is to what extent are our practices enabling realization of the attributes that the university seeks to achieve. So, what are these attributes and how we came into the those agreed attributes? So, these attributes were then adopted by the university as the attributes, as the kind of identities that the university will be working towards their realization. If you looking at our attributes, there are four. So here they are. There are four. We're talking about relational agents. Who can help us firstly before I explain this attribute? Who can help us understand or know the CPUT vision statement? Do you know what CPUT envisaged? Hear anything, Daniela? Any comment? Just anyone who can help us with the vision of the university. Hi, Friki.
Yeah, as I recall, it is CPUT is at the center of technology in Africa, or the heart.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, you're right. It says CPUT wants to be at the center of technological innovations in Africa. But then the question would be what it is that we do that make us to be distinctively African. In other words, what is it that you teach that would make the student to think, to view the world from that African ontological being? So this vision challenges us to think about who we are, our identity as African people in relation with the world. So relational agency speaks to how we view ourselves as African graduates or as African people with students working in an African university, and how we can work with the people of the world in order to solve the problems of the world. So think about this then in a context of your own field of practice. So if you're teaching or training teachers, how are your teachers prepared through the practices, through what is taught, how is taught, technological affordances that we bring for our students in order to think as African people in relation with the people of the world. Okay, Pam can't hear us, but then we'll probably share the recording. So relational agency speaks to that ability, firstly, centering who we are as African people, so that we develop graduates that can work with people across the divide. Not only enabling students to speak across the divide, but also to prepare them to engage with others that are different with care. Because if we understand that we come from different contexts and we will work in different working environments, what is important for us as people or as graduates is to understand how to engage in those relationships that we will end up working on as human beings. So relationality speaks to that. But if you are relating to someone else or you engage in this process, firstly, you need to take pride on who you are. So we say here, for us to have graduates that are firmly grounded on who they are, we need to make explicit that this is a university in Africa. So what it is then that we teach the students in what we are doing in our practices that would make them to understand that they are African. And these identities, it's not only that identity of being an African, they are also gendered beings. There are various ways in which society shapes who they are or socialize them to be who they are. How are they able then to work across those differences? So relationality speaks to that, or that relational agency speaks to that. But that attribute is related with the vision of the university, which says we want to be at the center of technological innovations in Africa. So what it is that you teach that would make them to think, see the world from the center, that is African ontological being. Now, think about your own discipline and say, what kind of a graduate that I'm developing? What it is that I'm teaching? Does it really make the student aware or know that I am an African? What is African about us at Cput? So you can look at your own practice and question yourself if you are doing that. And also, because I said these identities are multi-layered. If the student is working in a society where I said we are socialized differently, how do you prepare that student to engage with people that are coming from different backgrounds? If they are going to the industry, how are they going to work with those that come from different professions, but they will be working towards common projects? Because when they go to the industry, they won't be operating in isolation. They'll be working with others towards a shared goal or shared vision of that particular organization. Now, how do you prepare students for that in your own teaching, in what you teach and the tools that you are using? For instance, how is technological affordances used to ensure that students learn to work with people across various differences? Okay, that was the first attribute. I've linked it with Cput vision, which is to be at the center of technological innovation in Africa. But if we're talking about innovations innovations requires people that would think about alternatives to the current practices, that would think about how to best or how to do things better than what we've been doing in our own field. So that requires people that would draw on various ways of knowing, on knowledges in an open society that would enable them to think about alternatives. So to be innovative entails thinking beyond the present, think about better ways of improving or making your practices better than what you are doing or what people are already doing in your own field. So knowing requires, to enable these innovations to happen, it requires people that will draw on various knowledges. Technological agency. Here we're talking about how people will draw on these various knowledges in this pluriversal society and use technology or technological affordances to solve the problems of the world at the end of the day. So, what kind of a graduate that would come out of that space? Um, in terms of ways in which you think, in ways in which you assess your students, the opportunities that you provide, are you creating that possibility, that is knowing and technological agency, um, through the ways in which you teach, through the ways in which you assess, through technological affordances, because you cannot be talking about technological agents if there is no technology. Remember, Cput said, want to be the center of technological innovations in Africa, but where are those technological affordances? In other words, to what extent is the space that we see ourselves or working enabling the development or the realization of that agency? So you can now see that this is not an easy project. You cannot simply go to your own subject and say, I want to develop this kind of graduate. It's going to challenge you because these attributes to be realized in practice or in the real life, you need to deal with the enablements and constraints in your own space. In other words, you need to question, constantly question things that you do and improve. Take out that which is a constraint, bring that which you think will enable the possibility of the real attribute that you want to see. But as I've said, this can never happen if you are working in isolation. You need to work with others and work towards realization of those attributes. Okay. So the two attributes are kind of something attributes. One is resilience. So if we want to see attributes which think and see the world in this way, then you need people that are resilient, that would understand that in the world or the world it's not happening in a closed system. It's not a linear process. There are many variables at play which make our projects or which constrain us from achieving our projects in life. So that is a struggle. So you need to be resilient. You need to endure hardships if you want to achieve what you want to achieve. So what kinds of projects and problems that we give them at university would condition whether they become these resilient beings at the end of the day. So you can't give them simple solutions and you think that when they graduate, they will be resilient. You need to make sure that your assessment practices um, would make them to confront those dead ends and think or improvise in order to think about better ways in order to achieve what you want them to achieve. And then the last one is ethical imagination, ethics, to think about the effect of their own practices on others, um, because we affect each other in various ways, and we also affect the environment. You can think how our practices as people have an impact to that environment. And if we're not cautious of these effects of our practices, we can destroy each other, we can hurt each other, and we can also destroy the environment. Probably that's the reason why today we are sitting with climate change challenges. Our critically reflect and ask ourselves, to what extent are we enabling a realism from our students? So these attributes are four, but they are interrelational. So relationality requires ways of knowing, and relationality also requires technological agency. And technological agency requires us to think about the effects of our practices to the environment, to others, and all this requires us to be resilient as people. But when you're looking at these attributes, you can easily see that they are very much abstract. If you think about your own field, you can easily see that it will take um, thinking, serious thinking, in order to link these attributes with your own field. For instance, if you are from teaching background, you would think about the kind of a teacher that can exercise relationality. In other words, think about a teacher who is able to draw or to work with knowledges from the center as an African being and draw from other knowledges of the world to solve the problems which are confronting teachers in real life. So a teacher who's conscious of who he or she is can think about how to draw on knowledges across the spectrum to deal with the problems. And that requires someone who's curious, someone who's willing to explore, to engage with text, not to be limited or confined by particular ways of knowing, but draw on all knowledges and use technology in order to develop kids that would also think and see the world in a way or in a manner in which he or she does. So you can easily see here attributes as I was presenting to you speak to justice. And how do these attributes speak to justice? Justice in the sense that here we're talking about a graduate that thinks about others in society, not for him or herself as an individual, but for the public good. And we're talking about the graduate that is also aware of the effects of his or her own project, not only to others, but also to the environment in which he or she works, but also someone who's resilient enough to endure when confronted with challenges in life. So, in a nutshell, those are CPUT graduate attributes. Now, let's talk about your own challenges. How to make this possible in your own field, or in other words, how do we embed these graduate attributes in our practices as teachers? If you can share with me as to what you think about your own field. Let's say you are in film industry, how would you ensure that students, someone earlier when we were talking about film industry, I saw someone saying students need to know the theories of filmmaking. So whose knowledges or whose theories you talking about there? Are you able to ensure that students draw from the wide spectrum of ways of knowing about filmmaking? Are you providing an opportunity for these students to understand the impact of whatever that they are doing to other people that are different from them? So it's the scope of those theories. Is it really taking into consideration the context, that is the African context, if it's going to be relationality? So in other words, you can think about how your theories of filmmaking engage with the context, how you decolonize. So if we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about how you deal with the interests of the people in a particular context. How do you make those interests to be at the center so that the students that you develop become African students that can work with other people across the world? That is decolonization. Decolonization entails um, engaging with power dynamics in knowledge and in ensuring that students take pride first on who they are as African people in relation with other ways of knowing the world. So those are the Cput graduate attributes. And then I'm giving you an opportunity to reflect through your own practices and say, if these are Cput attributes, how do I see these attributes playing themselves out in my own field? Comrade Trick. Okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
okay. Yeah, I believe in my field, it's actually because I'm working across various departments, but I'm currently involved with the maritime students. And now, in terms of originality, uh,
Mhm.
they are experienced or they are students from various backgrounds. And I think it's important for the lecturer to try to create or encourage a working relationship between students so that they can meet each other from across the various backgrounds so they can do their crossing in terms of originality. But that would also be very important in the world of work because they're going to go to work on international different countries. So they will also must be able to relate to other cultures. So we should train them to be able to become confident and to be able to relate to other cultures and other contexts of their working conditions.
I think you're making a very powerful point, which speaks to who they are. So the ways in which you think, you teach them, enable them to take pride first on who they are. So there are many issues there, because in order to relate as authentic beings, they must be able to express themselves through various languages. They must be able to navigate across different cultures. They must be able to think about the effects of their own practices to others and those that are different that they are working with and those that they will work with in society, because we are not in a closed society. People are in the open society. There are many variables at play. But if they are not prepared for that at university level, they won't be able to engage. And that relational capability will be an ideal that will never be realized. So through your practices, you can easily see then that you can go on and trace or track your own practices and say, to what extent are these practices enabling or constraining a development of that particular capability? So, for instance, if you want to see or to develop an ethical graduate, so how do you cultivate ethical imagination? I'm talking about now spaces where students, imagine in our university, where they will be given assignments, and in developing these assignments, some would go to Google and cut and paste um, and submit those projects. They are stealing. Um, and if plagiarism is one of those crimes that we confronted with in university, we need to cultivate that ethical capability so that they know that what they are doing is unethical. It's not acceptable. So you cultivate that by giving them work or tasks that would make them think right, acknowledging other people's work and build or develop their own. That's how you cultivate that ethical capability. And you can also cultivate that ethical capability by making them reason about the projects that you give them, to say, in developing this project, these are ethical considerations that we took or we took into consideration in developing that project. So they make that explicit. And when they make that explicit, you would know that they would go to the world of work and think deeper before they can do. Imagine people who are working in a society working with technologies or chemicals, the dangerous science, um, and not think about the effects of those practices into the environment. So you can also think about people who don't want to to recognize that um, global warming is the reality and reduce uh, or try and minimize the effects of what they are using to the environment in order to avoid those catastrophes. So our curriculum has to be the kind of curriculum that is designed with the purpose of achieving a particular kind of a graduate. And this will never come um, uh, as it will never come as a how do I put it? It will never be realized if we're not asking ourselves, we're not reflecting on our practices and say, to what extent are these practices enabling or constraining realization of these identities? But at the center of this project is that of relational capability. So if your students are to be African, what it is that you teach to make them think and be or reason like an African being. So to be an African is not to be black, but is to see the world in a particular way, um, or in a using African philosophy in order to engage with the world. So what is African philosophy and how do you teach that if what is taught has got nothing to do with who the students are? So, Nwabo, yes, Nwabo,
Yes, I just have a quick question.
sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Okay.
can hear
My question is,
you clearly.
okay. My question is, if the university
Yeah.
is expecting its lecturers or its staff members to make sure that they create an environment whereby these graduate attributes are realized. So in terms of their teaching and learning, and in terms of aligning those with their assessments and everything, what has been done because I see this as a skill on its own or as an attribute from lecturers or staff members to something that they should have in order to be able to lay it down. Now, it has then been developments for staff members to actually to put them into power or to make sure that they're in the same boat as everyone else, as you put it as well.
Yes. You're raising a very important point, Sonabo. But here the challenge is, how do we that everyone buys into the project? I think that's the important thing. So we need to work with managers in our university, and if we work with them, we need to make them aware that if these attributes are to be realized in practice, they must create an enabling environment. They must support academic. They must provide interventions, workshops, so that academics could also um, develop. And if academics are not themselves trained properly or understand these attributes, those attributes cannot be achievable. They cannot be realized. Remember, we said they are possible realities. They are there, but for us to get there, we need to question. We need to look at and say, if you want to have or to be this university is at the heart of technological innovations in Africa, how do you make first our students to think and see the world from that point of view? That is to be an African. Technological innovations. You cannot be at the heart of technological innovations when there is no technology space. So we're asking those questions. What are technological affordances? We're looking at our spaces and we can question those in the positions of power. We can, in fact, push them because we are challenging them to create that space. So, in whatever corners in which we find ourselves, we're fighting towards. Remember, we said at the center of this project, there is Ubuntu. So, we say to managers, to leaders of our university, how do we ensure that there is justice at the end? There is a student who comes from the university not to get skills and go out and work only, but the student that would change the social relations of power, the student that would take the family and the society forward. Because we can't be training people or developing people that would be the servants of others for the rest of their life. In that way, we are reproducing society. Uh, and if we're not questioning that, education will just be useless and a tool that is used by those who've got means of production to continue enjoying privilege while others are suffering. Let's take other questions. What do you foresee as a challenge for your own field? How possible it is in your own field to bring these various ways of thinking so that students can be knowing rather than know one particular worldview. Stalo? Yes, Stalo. I can't hear you at all. Can you hear me? But I can't hear you. Okay. Hello.
You should have your mic is on, so you should be able to talk. But you can also just paste, you can just type something in the chat window if we can't hear you.
We're listening, Stelo. I can hear you trying to talk, but the
We
audio
can't
doesn't.
hear
We
you.
can't hear you at all. And Aaron is also not. But write something, Stelo. Oh, he's typing.
Mavi, you've been also very quiet. Do you have any comments on this presentation? Any questions? I think Jared left.
Oh. Oh. Who's still with us is Sonabo.
Mavi and so maybe while we are waiting for others to comment, just to just talk a little bit about what's happening now between this week and next week. We've got another activity on the Google document where we ask you to reflect on some of the things that we've discussed today and how that would apply to your practice. And I really urge you to do these exercises because listening to the webinar is just one part. You need to apply and think and contextualize this content. And I think one learns so much when you see how other people think and what ideas they have. And the more we share, I think the more we can learn from each other and build a community of practice. So I really urge you to take a few minutes. It won't take that long, and do these activities. Also, we have shared many resources on the course site, the Google site. I'm going to share the link later via an email with the recording. Lots of articles, lots of interesting materials that you can go through if you're interested to read more, and also the graduate attributes, the Cput charter for graduate attributes. So you get a summary of and a bit more information on the 4 areas that Siya has spoken about.
Yeah.
Is there anything from your side?
Because from my side, what I want you to always take into consideration is that when you working with students, you working with people that come from a society which positioned themselves differently. So if a society present opportunities for others and disadvantage for others, you need to be asking yourself then as a teacher as to what extent are these practices your own practices, making sure that there is change in ways in which we live in society. Remember, this is a society that we are thrown into. We didn't choose to be born into this society. We are thrown into it. But if we're not doing anything about it, we will simply reproduce it and perpetuate societal inequalities. So these graduate attributes are designed in order to help you think deeper about the students and how to make them improve their lives and lives of others in society so that we can have a better world, a world that is beyond the present or better than what we inherited or we are thrown into. Thank you.
Thanks, Siya.
I think Stella is still writing.
Something.
Huh?
But I'm going to stop the recording now. We can continue our conversation.